When we talk about culture, I want you to tell me what are the implications of the word that comes to your mind. The word culture. It doesn't mean one single thing. It could mean a number of things. Louder? Yeah. Very good. So, nature versus culture. That's what I have as the first possible meaning of culture here. Culture as synonymous with civilization. സംസ്കാരം എന്നാൽ സംസ്കൃതി എന്ന അർത്ഥത്തിൽ നമ്മൾ ഉപയോഗിക്കുമ്പോൾ that is one of the senses in which we use the word culture. Nature versus culture. It comes from, if you look at the etymology of it, the word colle from Latin, it means to cultivate, to nurture, to take care of something. So it is not a naturally occurring thing. You have to put effort into bringing into being. So that sense, it is this enlightenment view of culture that we are talking about in the first meaning of culture. It is the transformation from a biological existence into a social being. The transformation of man from an animal into a social being. That is the first sense in which we use the word culture. Now we have a slightly narrower version of meaning of the word culture, which is culture as a value system, behavior, moral ethical constitution of an individual or a community. It is in this sense that we use the phrases Indian culture, American culture, or a cultured person. So anthropologist Margaret Mead says culture is the learned social behavior of a subgroup. So it is not universal. If you compare the first meaning of culture with this one, this is more particular. It's limited to a group, whereas the first one is more universal in nature. Culture in that sense applied to the whole of humanity. Here it is applicable to a group. The peculiarities of moral ethical conduct of a subgroup. What are the other possible senses of the meaning word culture? Culture as high culture, like art, literature, aesthetics. It is in this classical music, poetry, fine arts. So this is not everyone's cup of tea. You need to be a erudite person. You need to be a connoisseur in order to be able to appreciate culture in this sense. This is again one of the meanings of the word culture. And then it takes a connoisseur to appreciate Mona Lisa or Mozart or Gothic structure. Everybody would not be able to access it or appreciate it. It is in this sense that we engage the phrases man of culture, or the word classy, someone of taste, as opposed to with something which is kitsch or popular culture. Kitsch means something that is banal, something which doesn't involve any kind of sophistication, okay, something which is of bad taste, as opposed to which you have a man of culture, a culture vulture, someone who consumes a lot of cultural products such as these. This is another sense of the word culture. Then you have a social definition of culture, culture as a whole way of life, not just art, not just architecture, not just poetry, not just civilization, not high culture, not that belongs to any particular group, but the whole way of life, the sum total of the ordinary, everyday, interconnected aspects of a group of people. That will include what you eat, what kind of clothes you wear, what kind of films you watch, what art, what you consume from the market, what you know, what you don't know, everything included. How you behave as a crowd, everything included. The sum total of a group is called, this is the social definition of culture. And it is this meaning of culture that would be most useful to culture studies. Culture studies, this is something again very basic. You might already know this. It began in Britain in the 1950s by a group of scholars that included Richard Hoggart, Raymond Williams, Stuart Hall, and A.P. Thompson. They were interested in the post-industrial revolution working class culture of the Britain. So Richard Hoggart, these are some of the seminal tests. So sir had asked me to include some details that might be useful for your NET examination. So this is it. So uses of literacy, aspects of working class life, the making of English working class, culture and society. These are some of the key texts in the beginning phase of culture studies. Most of these scholars were from the working class background, and they were writing about the culture that they belonged to with a sense of belonging. It was not a disinterested pursuit. For them, it was very subjective and it was very personal as well. Richard Hoggett was someone who thought that English working class had a certain unique culture to themselves, that of pubs, that of getting together, what they did after work, what they did for leisure and all. And then he thought it was being attacked by the influx of American culture. So it's with a certain sense of nostalgia, long lost working class culture that he puts across his theories and studies. E.P. Thompson, Raymond Williams. Again, Raymond Williams is the person who said culture is ordinary. If you want to study culture, it's not the ivory towers that you look at, you look around. Again, in the fourth sense of culture that we discussed, it's ordinary, it's everyday, it's banal. You don't look in the high positions for culture. So he made this is a very revolutionary statement, radical statement to make, because if you look at the literary tradition prior to Raymond Williams, prior to culture studies, they've always talked about culture as a grand big thing. If you take what T.S. Eliot or F.R. Lewis or Matthew Arnold has said about culture, it's not in that sense that Raymond Williams is talking about culture. He's talking about it as a whole way of life, as lived culture. Now you have a very important institution in culture studies coming into being, that is the Center for Contemporary Culture Studies, established at Birmingham in 1964. Now, how is culture studies different from the pre-existing disciplines? It problematized the following notions. The liberal humanist notion of culture as a process of human progress and instrument of refinement. It also problematizes, as I previously mentioned, the idea of culture in the literary tradition as something. What does Matthew Arnold say about culture? That is the best that have been thought and expressed in the history of mankind. And there you have a group of scholars from the English working class telling, no, it needn't always be the best and the high culture. It could be everyday life of ordinary people as well. Now, they were also against, the culture studies scholars were also against the massification, standardization of culture, especially as imposed by much later by Thatcherism, that there are particularities of regional groups, there are particularities of subgroups, cultural particularities. When a standardized culture is imposed, these specificities of cultures are taking a back seat. Everything comes under the umbrella term of English national culture. It comes by sacrificing small cultures, subcultures. So they were against the massification of culture as well. They were also against the idea of culture as always already there. So it is not there. It is a process through which it is coming into being. And this process is important. The analysis should focus on how a certain culture came into being. Nothing was there, always already there. There is a certain story of origin. There's a genealogy to culture, is what these people have insisted on. They were also, interestingly, though they were very class conscious, they were against the Marxist concept of culture as belonging to the superstructure. So in Marxist theory, economics is the base of the society. Everything that happens in legal system, in education system, in media, in family is determined, is the term that Marxist theorists use, is determined by the economic base of the society. But then they have a reservation on this. Culture studies scholars have a reservation on this. They say culture is not that superficial thing of society. It is very essential aspect of a society. It is not that factor which is just determined by economics. It is as important as the economic base of the society. That's why we say with the emergence of culture studies, you have a cultural turn in the social sciences. Like they had a linguistic turn in the studies with the coming of structuralism. At a late, around 60s and 70s, you also have a cultural turn in social sciences. Now, they always say culture studies is not a discipline per se. It is anti-disciplinary and interdisciplinary. What does interdisciplinary mean? It's a phrase we use on a regular basis. Just drawing on different disciplines, would that make an engagement interdisciplinary? I would rather say it's multidisciplinary. So what does that factor that makes a multidisciplinary engagement into interdisciplinary engagement? Multidisciplinary is when I bring in a number of disciplines into play. Some say, for example, political science and history into play to study something that lies at the conjuncture of both these disciplines. I might not tweak or I might not upset the theories and methodologies of either of the disciplines. I can keep these disciplines intact and have a multidisciplinary study on something that lies in the overlapping area of these disciplines. But interdisciplinary involves a little upsetting of the structure of the discipline. Interdisciplinary is where I ask the object of a discipline questions that it has not been asked so far. I might ask a semiotic question to an object of history or political science, and I might draw upon methodologies and theories from across the discipline. That is when an interdisciplinary study is possible. Now, it is anti-disciplinary in the sense that culture studies does not have a well-defined area of study. If you ask me, what do you study in history? What you study in economics, I might be able to give you a more concrete answer. The area of study is much more defined when it comes to conventional social sciences or humanities and arts. But when it comes to culture studies, because it subscribes to the fourth meaning of culture that we dealt with as belonging, culture as belonging to the everyday life, the whole aspect of life. I can talk about clothing, I can talk about food, I can talk about film. So when I am talking about culture, in the sociological meaning of culture, everything about our lived, our life, our existence comes under its perusal. So there is no one particular area that I would say culture studies looks at. It doesn't have a well-defined methodology either. So if you are a researcher of culture studies, when you do your coursework, usually in other disciplines, you are trained in the methodology of that particular discipline. Then again, a quick detour. Sometimes in Kerala, I found that by methodology, it's synonymously used with formatting. Is that so in your college also? Is it MLA format? Does methodology mean MLA format here? Okay, I mean a different thing by methodology. MLA format for me is styling. Okay, it is a referencing styling. Methodology means an entirely different thing. Methodology, or what we call in Malayalam, Didi Shastram, is the strategies or the ways you use to arrive at the conclusion of your research. What are the methods of investigation that you employ in order to study your object? For instance, we definitely have textual analysis. If you are looking at something, a film or an event or a book as a text and looking at the analysis, decoding of meaning, if you are engaging in a semiotic study, that would be textual analysis. The method is textual analysis. Now, if you are going to live with the people that you are studying about, if you are studying about a particular community and you spend considerable amount of time with them, you live with them, that is ethnographical methodology. And if you have a lot of surveys involved, you interview people, that is sociological methodology. And if your study involves a lot of historical documents, you go to the archives and dig out documents, that is historical methodology. So methodology is entirely different from MLA formatting. Formatting is just the reference style. So here when I use methodology, I use it in the sense that I talked about. What are the ways in which, what are the methods that you would employ in order to efficiently, rigorously study your object. So it doesn't have, again, culture studies doesn't have a well-defined methodology either. It would borrow from across disciplines. And it doesn't have a clearly demarcated field of investigation either. This is Simon During, who has written again a seminal text in culture studies. This is culture studies reader. Now, engaged culture studies. We have a phrase called engaged culture studies. Usually they say when you're a scholar, you have to keep your personal interests, prejudices, experiences aside and engage with your object of study in a impersonal, disinterested, rather objective manner. Now, British culture studies said, no, this is not what we aim to do. We are very much inside what we are studying. As I told you, Richard Hoggard, Raymond Williams, they were all from the working class background and they had investment in it when they were studying about the English working class. It is not a disinterested pursuit of facts. It's focused on subjectivity. Now, this was not accepted in the academic circles easily. You have to understand that, because in social sciences or in sciences, objectivity was a key criterion. So this was difficult to, this idea of culture studies as engaged culture studies, it took a while to gain acceptance in the academic circles, because of which many people did not consider culture studies as a serious academic engagement until a later point in time. And it is also about, if you simply study culture, would that become culture studies? There's a difference between culture studies and cultural studies. If I come into Kerala as an outsider and I look at what Kerala people do during Onam, and I write about it, that they play Tiruvadira, they arrange for Sadhya, and would that make culture studies? A plain study about culture, would that amount to be called cultural studies? No? If I go to the museums and write about the sculptures, and if I go to the palaces and write about the architecture, or culture in the other sense of the word, I live among the working class of a particular area and write about it, would that make it culture studies? What is this additional twist that requires the study of culture to be qualified as cultural studies? Yeah, subjective is there, something else is required. Anyone? I have it on the screen, you just have to read it out. Yes? The politics of culture. Culture studies, the key concern of culture studies, the distinguishing factor of culture studies is the fact that it is bothered, it's concerned about the power equations that underlie our apparently innocent cultural practices. So if I am looking at Onam, I would, from a culture studies perspective, I would ask the question, is it in fact a secular, universal festival of all the Malayalis? Whom did it initially belong to? And if it belonged to everyone, would you have in place Onam vannalum, Unni pirannalum, Korinu Kanni, Kumbilil Thanne? It refers to a certain feudal past, feudal origins of this festival. If it is a harvest festival, then I would ask the question, whose granaries were filled during the harvest and who starved during the harvest festival? If everyone is wearing a Kasava Mundu during Onam, whom did this cloth belong to at a certain point in time? Was everyone in Kerala permitted to wear this cloth at one point in time? Were people punished in Kerala of certain class or groups, punished in Kerala for wearing Kasav sari or Kasava Mundu? So these are the politically engaged questions I would ask to the festival of Onam if I were engaging it from the viewpoint of cultural studies. Then it stops being a secular universal festival of all the Malayalis. Then I would also ask the question, if it belonged to only certain groups at one point in time, what is the reason for the popularity of Onam? What is the reason for the contemporary popularity of Onam? What role did the formation of Kerala state in 1956 have to play in it? What role did the official policies regarding say giving holidays for Onam or policies, official policies have to play in the making of Onam into a phenomenon like it is now? What role did the diaspora play in celebrating Onam the way we do? What role did market play in making Onam a big event? So these are the kind of questions. If you look at it, I'm asking questions across disciplines. I'm asking into Kerala, I'm asking questions to Kerala history. I'm asking questions about market, which involves economics. I'm asking questions about politics, the formation of Kerala state and the constitution of the Kerala Legislative Assembly and the possible, what was the caste equations of the Kerala Legislative Assembly and how did it contribute to the phenomenon of Onam. I'm asking questions about demography, population studies. A certain section of Malayali emigrants might have had a certain role in creating a certain idea of Onam, a nostalgic sense with which they celebrate Onam. So you see the questions goes all across disciplines and I am specifically concerned with the power equations that underlie the underlie the making of Onam. Is it clear now? What are the questions? Okay. Now, again, another distinguishing feature of culture studies is that it does not aim at a neutral assessment of your object of study. You need to be politically engaged as a scholar of culture studies. That's what Stuart Hall always insisted on. Like you sit in your own confined space and make theories, that doesn't make you a true culture studies scholar. You have to be in the middle of what you are talking about. The Gramscian idea of organic intellectual, someone who speaks about it, somebody who has the moral, ethical, intellectual responsibility of making people aware about it, also be in the scene of action. So activist and theorist in one person is culture studies idea of scholar. Now, when it comes to what I was talking about British culture studies, American culture studies might have a different take altogether. They did not believe in the idea of engaged culture studies or scholar as an activist. They had a different take on it. American culture studies lacked the leftist leanings of the British culture studies. And when it came to India, when this discipline, I wouldn't say it as a discipline, when this field of study, when this method of investigation made its way into Indian academia, it had both continuities and discontinuities with British culture studies. If the British culture studies was mostly concerned with the idea of class, we had other categories here. We were mostly concerned with caste, gender, religion, and also colonialism and post-colonialism were also key concerns for culture studies in India. Coming to the last point, radical wing of historiography. Because they say our historiography, our histories were initially written by the Western scholars, and there was a counter movement by nationalist historiographers, and there are histories that got missed out on in between these, which was an attempt by the subaltern historiographers to bring out. Even then, there were facets of history. There were people, experiences that did not figure in any of this history writing traditions. So, culture studies engaged with that particular aspect as well. So, this is about the basic, this is for a basic understanding of culture studies. And you have to understand that it is closely associated with literary studies, culture studies, because of which it involves a deciphering of signs. Semiotics is a method that culture studies very often employs, because you are trying to understand what is the meaning of this sign. Again, coming back to Onam, If you're wearing a Kerala sari, what does that particular sign, cultural sign of Kerala sari imply? What are you aspiring for when you're trying to wear that? Why this sari and why not some other sartorial choice for Onam? So semiotics is key to a culture studies engagement. Now we'll do a short exercise in culture studies, a hands-on practice, so much for theory. As I said, culture studies asks a different set of questions to objects of conventional disciplines. In history, in Indian history and in political science, we know Gandhi and Ambedkar had their differences. And what were their key differences with each other? Ambedkar said nothing less than annihilation of caste. There's no going around it in a smooth way. Gandhi said, okay, he condemned the violences and cruelties imposed by the caste system, the caste practices, but he was not ready to do away with the Varna system per se. What other differences did they have? Ambedkar belonged, very good. Ambedkar belonged to a Maha community from Maharashtra, while Gandhi belonged to Baniya from Gujarat, Vaishya community. Now, both were Western educated barristers. When Gandhi enters the politics in India, he chooses to wear, he leaves behind the suit and he chooses to wear Indian clothes, a hand-woven khadi cloth. But while Ambedkar always sticks to the suit. This is a sartorial choice that two popular leaders in India made. Now we know the history lessons of it, we know the political science lessons behind it. I want you to analyze the clothing choices of Gandhi and Ambedkar from a culture studies perspective. Why did they choose what they chose? This definitely involves semiotics. You have to read into signs. Clothing is a sign. What are the possible meanings of their choices? It involves where they're coming from, B, what they aimed at. They were coming from, the background is already clear. Ambedkar is coming from a backward Dalit community, of Maha community, who were denied education for all the time we can remember, and Gandhi comes from a privileged community. Metin has a point that Ambedkar coming from a community to whom education was denied for millennia, it's with Western education. They did not place their bet on anything Indian to save them. If they had any hopes, it's on Western education. All these years of Sanatana Dharma did nothing to empower them. If they have to move forward for upward mobility, they have to look at Western education, modern education. For Ambedkar, his choice of clothing represented where he thought empowerment would come from, modern Western education. It also stood for their aspiration. Like these are the people who were not permitted to wear certain kind of clothes. Like in Kerala, I said certain people were not allowed to wear kasavu. These people were not allowed to wear certain clothes. So Ambedkar's suit, Western clothing, becomes a symbol of aspiration for the people from their community. If you look at the case study, there have been enough studies about the popularity of Ambedkar statues in certain states, including Uttar Pradesh. Ambedkar as wearing a suit, carrying the constitution and a pen in his pocket. These are all signs of scholarship, of aspiration, of westernization, of modern, of justice as constitution stood for. So whatever iconography you find in Ambedkar statues they are all standing for the aspiration of the community that he spoke for, as opposed to which, what did Gandhiji's cloth choices have to do? Why did he choose? So he was derogatively called as half-naked fakir. He had the intention of promoting indigenous textile industry. That is one thing. He wanted to connect with the masses, is the main thing. He wanted to connect with the masses. He thought India lives in a villages. He had actually urged us to go back to the villages. He took modernization with a pinch of salt. technology and modernization with a pinch of salt. His idea of India, it lived in its villages and it had to fall back on the traditional wisdoms and practices that the subcontinent had. Secondly, because he had to connect with the masses. So if he thought if he wore a suit, he would stand apart from them. So he wanted to connect with the Indian masses and lead a mass movement, which is why he chose something that he thought the people would identify with. As opposed to which, Ambedkar was no fan of Indian villages. He thought they were still pools of ignorance and discrimination. You see, they coming from different background. Gandhiji being class privileged and caste privileged, village was no realm of discrimination for him. But Ambedkar has taken the brunt of discrimination that exists in Indian villages. So he thought Indian villages were still pools of ignorance. So he did not aspire to fall back on village culture. He did not fall back on Indian culture because he knows very well as a Dalit, it has nothing to offer to the Dalit community. Gandhiji thought otherwise. So they chose their clothing on the basis of how they have lived so far, what they aimed at, what kind of India they had in mind, and also their own personal experiences in a caste-ridden society. This is one of the ways. I wouldn't say this is the only way. This is one of the ways in which you would look at history from a perspective of culture studies. Now, a historian wouldn't engage in this way. He doesn't have the time, or the scope of the discipline wouldn't permit him to ask questions about what Ambedkar wore or what Gandhiji wore. He would put it out for you that they had disagreements with each other and they had bitter disagreements regarding special electorates for Dalit community, and Gandhiji went into fasting and Ambedkar had to compromise on. This is what history tells you. Political science similarly would tell you another version of understanding these key figures in modern Indian history. Culture studies this is one of the ways in which culture studies would draw upon both history and political science and semiotics to understand another unexplored aspect of Indian past. Is that clear? Now, another exercise. This is an installation, a life-size diorama in a museum. This represents a rite of human sacrifice that colonial historian says existed in the Kond tribe of eastern India, Orissa, Jharkhand, etc. So this was a practice where tribals of the Kond tribe would get together. They would make cuts on a person and the person would bleed, and this person's blood and flesh would be carried to their field and sacrificed to the mother earth for better yield, especially of turmeric. So this is a very contested history because later subaltern historiographers have pointed out that this practice did not exist at all. This was a reason that the Britishers made up in order to justify their entry into the tribal region in eastern and central India. They made it the white man's burden to refine these barbaric people. So they said human sacrifice is barbaric, though symbolically human sacrifice is at the center of Christianity that the Britishers believed in. But then they said this is barbaric, this is unaccepted. The colonial forces, the colonial administrative system, military system has to intervene into these regions to control these tribal practices. Now the historical contestations are there, but this is a state-sponsored museum in Hyderabad, tribal museum, apparently established for the promotion of tribal history and culture. As one enters this museum, this is a central installation in the museum, the one of Mediarite. What are the possible meanings of these? What does an installation of Mediarite, which is historically contested, do in a state-sponsored museum which is ostensibly established for the promotion of tribal culture? There's a colonial epistemology on media right. Is the state epistemology any different? Is the post-colonial epistemology on it any different? While the colonial powers made it a justification to portray the tribals in a negative way, in a villainous way, in a barbarous way, to intervene into their realm of operation, the state, the post-colonial state is also doing the same. Imagine this caters to an urban crowd. The tribals are not the one who visits the museum. It's the urban crowd who visits the museum. In their mind, especially this belonging to Andhra Pradesh and Telangana, where there's a lot of appropriation of tribal land by the state government involved in the name of modernization. This gives a picture of the tribal as pre-modern, that which requires the intervention of the state agencies to modernize them. So the burden now of sophistication, of refining, of bringing them back to civilization is upon the state government. Earlier it was on the colonial administration. So we are continuing a certain colonial discourse which was generated on a certain group of people. Imagine this created a lot of, this was very disturbing installation for a lot of children who used to visit the museum, and it was later removed. So imagine the kind of idea that would be generated in the mind of the children, mostly urban, upper class, school going children, upon visiting the museum. So this is the discourse analysis. Earlier we did semiotic analysis of two personalities. This would be an analysis of discourse. What is a discourse? Institutionally ratified set of knowledges and statements that could be made about a subject. The way we understand, way we popularly understand, validated, justified knowledges about a particular thing is called, that is a very simplified way of putting it, but that would do for our purpose. In this installation, earlier we just read into the science. We just did a simple semiotic analysis. That wouldn't suffice here. Here we have to go a step ahead to an advanced level and see. Here there is nothing much to, there is no particular symbol to analyze. But then you would be analyzing at what discourse did colonialism generate on the Kond tribe. Subsequently, what discourse, what statements, set of knowledges did the government, nationalist government generate on these people, and what do these discourses do to this people and also to the outsider? How do we represent, especially the representation of the other? These are key concerns for culture studies. That's all. Thank you.